Ever since I was a little girl, I've been wondering, why am I here in this wonderful, magical place? What is the purpose of my life? And how did this all come to be? But as time went on, my curiosity turned to dread. There was this voice in my head saying, the machine will eat you, it will eat your dreams, it will eat your curiosity, and you will never know the answers to all of your questions. 15 years later, I finally understand what that means. The machine, the system that we live in, is not built for curiosity, wonder, or difference. It's built to produce output, make goods, offer services, profit, repeat. By the time you're ready to go to work and make money, you've stopped asking questions, being curious, doing things just for the sake of doing them. By the time you're ready to work and make money, you're eaten. For most people, that's where this story ends. But what if you don't fit into the system? What if you cannot fit in no matter how hard you try? What if you have ADHD? Hi, I'm Antonia and I'm an ADHD coach with ADHD. In this video, I want to talk about ADHD and capitalism. Specifically, why a healthy, thriving, happy, fulfilled life with ADHD is fundamentally incompatible with the capitalist system. Not because we're broken, but because the system is. Because the system defines productivity, success, and worth in a way that excludes people who aren't normal by default. So I'll show you how the idea of normal was invented, who it's actually serving, and why it makes us feel broken and guilty for things that are not our fault or even within our control. We'll look at the three biggest narratives surrounding ADHD. Is it even real? Is it laziness or maybe a superpower? To see how their outdated, oppressive ideas are still shaping how ADHDers are treated and how we see ourselves today. Of course, we will end on a positive note with solutions, practical things you can do today to live a healthier, happier, easier life with ADHD. So, if you've ever thought, why can't I just get my shit together? This essay will finally show you why it's not your fault and how fighting for yourself is part of something much bigger. But to understand all of this, you first have to ask, what even is normal? Because being normal isn't just about being a regular human, as we might assume. If you look into it, it's much more about being average in the mathematical sense. So having average abilities, health, functioning compared to everyone else. And that means that people who have different ways of functioning and experiencing the world, people with disabilities, will all fall outside that definition. And yet, at some point in time, we decided to build a world that serves the needs and abilities of the average person and simply excludes almost everyone else. Like today, it feels natural that you should be able to go to work at 9 a.m. and feel ready. And if you're not, you must be doing something wrong. You need a better bedtime routine, better habits, because for the average person, that's pretty doable. But it wasn't always like this. We created this inequality over time in a very specific historical context. And when you truly understand where all of these societal norms and expectations come from, you'll finally be able to stop blaming yourself for not fitting into this bullshit system. So, to explain that, I'll be referring to this book called Empire of Normality by Professor Robert Chapman, a neurodiversity advocate who is also autistic. And I'll be linking more resources and studies in the description in case you want to go deeper. So, Chapman starts by explaining how the idea of normal functioning would have been wholly alien to the medics of antiquity because they saw health as a kind of balance, not just within the person's body, but between their body and their environment, their community. In those times, work was slower, more flexible, often done with one's family or within the community, producing little more than what was needed for people to survive, which made it easier for them to accommodate each other's needs and to accept a much wider range of functioning than we do today. A deaf or blind grandmother, for instance, may have still been able to weave or cook. A man with a cognitive disability may have labored in the fields or helped in manufacturing, and people with mobility impairments could still work from home. But right before the Industrial Revolution, everything started to change fast. French philosopher René Descartes was one of the first to compare the human body to a machine, one made up of different parts that all work together to maintain health. He wrote that specific parts of the body or one's overall bodily functioning could be either working or broken and therefore fixed by anyone with sufficient knowledge and resources. Health was no longer about balance and harmony, and it lost its ties to a person's environment and their community, becoming much more about functioning, working, or being broken. In the Industrial Revolution, that metaphor was widely accepted as truth. It gave factory owners an easier way to evaluate people because they couldn't factor in all the personal quirks, needs, and rhythms of the employees, their harmony within and without. But they wanted to have predictable output at scale. As new machines and workdays were increasingly standardized, the ideal worker was likewise standardized. Workers increasingly needed to be mobile enough to be able to travel to the factory, and they needed to be able to work in line with the pace and production norms of the industrial workspace. So the ideal worker had to be able-bodied and productive enough to keep up. But how do you know that someone is like that? You need some way to rank and compare people, some kind of benchmark for them to fulfill. That's when being normal entered the picture. Pioneered by Belgian statistician Adolphe Quetelet in his 1835 book, The Average Man, his theory goes that the weight and stature of a man may be measured directly, and we may afterwards compare that to the weight and stature of another man. In comparing the different men of a nation in this matter, we arrive at average values, which are the weight and stature proper to be assigned to the average man. He went on to say that if the average man were completely determined, we might consider him as a type of perfection, and everything differing from his proportions or condition would constitute a monstrosity. So that was a take, one that was widely adopted by the colonialist, racist, and other oppressive movements of the time, and all those that came after, including fascists, Nazis, and other ideologies that required one type of person to be inferior to another. Because the power to judge who is superior and who is inferior is the power to judge who deserves to have freedom and rights, to have ownership, to have control. For the colonies around the world, the average man would be a white, middle-class man of typical ability, and he now exemplified all that was good and proper, while those who deviated from normality were monstrous and in need of fixing. The idea of the average man basically allowed the exploitation of some people to be seen as part of the natural order, so that others could take from them, profit off that exploitation, and justify it with science. The people in power loved it. The bosses loved it, and slowly but surely, the idea spread. Middle-class, cognitively able white people increasingly came to see themselves as naturally closer to an idealized, normal, and even supernormal way of being and thinking when compared to disabled, working-class, black, and brown colonized subjects. To have any kind of subnormal cognition was increasingly feared and stigmatized, especially among the upper classes in Europe, as well as among white settlers around the globe. And that's how average became the ideal, the best way to function, to be included, to be rewarded. We have mostly forgotten where this ideal came from and who it serves best, but because it sounds logical, it's math, and it has just enough science behind it, we've pretty much come to accept it without question. But we can't accept it. We can't and should not internalize this false narrative and blame ourselves for not fitting in to this unjust system. People aren't machines to compare and optimize. We are complex, diverse individuals with unique ways of functioning, unique strengths and weaknesses. And our environments matter. Our communities matter. Harmony matters. Forcing us all to fit one narrow norm is oppressive, and it builds a world for just one type of person, framing all of our differences as deficits, deviations from that average ideal. So we're forced to mask them in order to survive. But it's all about perspective. Just yesterday, I read this study about the so-called communication deficits in people with autism. Turns out that those only showed up in interactions with neurotypical normal people, because between autistic people themselves, communication was just as rich and efficient as it is between neurotypicals. It's just different. Our differences don't have to be deficits. That is a concept that only makes sense inside this bullshit hierarchy, the so-called empire of normality. And do we really want to base our self-worth on the theory of some statistician from the 1800s, on the favorite myth of the racists and oppressors around the world? I don't, and more importantly, I don't want you to. That's why I'm making this video. We'll come back to Chapman's book later and talk about solutions, alternatives, how things could be. But first, let's go back to ADHD and the narratives about ADHD that emerged in this historical context. Is it a superpower? Is it something that you can fix, control, or improve? Or are you just lazy? And who do those narratives really serve? Dun, dun, dun. Bosses, investors, capitalists, they want to keep making more money forever. So you have to keep being more productive forever. Or else you might lose your job and have nothing to eat. That usually means being productive and focused for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, working when you're expected to, in whatever environment you are given, being friendly, proactive, and presentable, all for the sake of graph go up. But that's just not possible with ADHD and with many other disabilities, really, not without serious sacrifices, support, or privilege. According to a 2022 European Commission report, between 50 and 80% of people with disabilities are unemployed, and many who do work can only do so part-time, between 10 and 50%. And yes, they are usually paid less. So as much as we can, we push through, we march forward, we work longer to compensate for our struggles. We sacrifice rest, self-care, and even health because these things don't pay the bills. And we're often too scared to ask for accommodations because we don't want to seem like we are the problem or risk losing our jobs from the judgment. So we have to suffer in silence and watch productivity videos, read self-help books, and try any ADHD hack we can find just to survive. The system has stripped away so much of our social support and stigmatized so many of our struggles that we often feel like we have no other choice. That's a systemic problem known as extractive abandonment that most of these self-everything industries aren't mentioning nearly enough. And that's not okay. You can't fix everything by yourself. You don't live in a vacuum. So unless you have some rare privilege like access to hired help, cleaners, tutors, assistant, or tools like planners, apps, devices, professional support like medication, therapy, coaching, the support of people in your life. Unless you have those things, you have to make sacrifices. Your mental health, your physical health, relationships, passions, your actual enjoyment of life are the real cost of success in the capitalist system. That's a price everyone pays to some extent. But for people with ADHD and other disabilities, it's often unbearably high. And in this whole landscape, 3 major narratives about ADHD have emerged. Narrative number 1, ADHD doesn't exist, or you're just lazy. People who don't understand mental health tend to hold this view often because its effects are felt by us but not seen by others. Neurotypical, normal people tend to project their own capabilities onto us, then they assume that our struggles are some kind of motivation problem. After all, the system says that if you work hard and focus, anything is possible. So if you try and you can't do that, it's easy to conclude that you are lazy or that your problem just isn't real. Either way, the responsibility to fix yourself falls on you, or you will have to suffer the consequences. The system owes you no support. But let's talk about laziness for a second, because you're not lazy. No one is. There is no psychological diagnosis or condition of laziness. No one has laziness because it doesn't exist. If you looked a bit closer at someone who is lazy, you'd probably see that they're actually tired, burned out, demotivated by a boring task or low salary or crappy working conditions, ill or disabled, lacking proper support, or just trying to enjoy being alive for a second. When ADHDers seem lazy, 99% of the time it's one of those things. And maybe if we actually stopped calling them lazy, we'd be able to diagnose and help more of them instead. There are so many solutions to all of these problems, but that would mean helping people, changing the system, offering actual support. And it's just way too easy to shame people into submission instead. If we call them lazy, they will push themselves harder to prove that they aren't. They will police each other so no one slacks off. And it's a win-win for the system. So
remember who the real enemy is.
And what about being real? Is ADHD real? Yes. But that's a question the so-called anti-psychiatry movement has been asking for a while about all kinds of mental illness. Psychiatrist Thomas Schatz argued that mental illness was just a metaphor taken too far by psychiatry and that mentally ill people weren't actually ill or in need of assistance, but just morally weak and avoiding responsibility. He campaigned to close institutions and cut government spending for mental health patients and gained widespread support, mostly because the asylums back then were actually kind of a shithole. So, thanks to his movement, they closed almost all of them by the 1980s and the government saved lots of money. But the patients were left with their unprepared families, jobless, homeless, in nursing homes, or most often in prison. These days, there's not that much of an anti-psychiatry movement, but there is a critical psychiatry movement, a movement of clinical professionals who are often selling some books or yapping on a podcast. Think Gabor Mate or Jordan Peterson. They'll say things like ADHD is just childhood trauma and spread a form of disability denial that is not much better than anti-psychiatry. That's where we're left at today. Mental health support is scarce and inaccessible. If we get anything at all, it's usually access to mass-produced medication, but otherwise, we're pretty much left to fend for ourselves. Which takes us to narrative number 2. ADHD is real and it can be fixed. It's half true, I'll give it that, but why claim you can fix it? I mean, some of that still probably comes from those neurotypicals who can't fully relate to our experiences. They must be seeing that we can get diagnosed now and that we can get meds, therapy, coaching, and all these things, and think that is enough for us to overcome our struggle because it would be for them. And some of us probably believe them. But fact check, most ADHDers don't actually have access to these things. For many others, they don't even work or they stop working after a while. And for those of us that they do help, they get like a 40 to 60% symptom reduction at best, and that's just for a few hours per day. Plus, we don't live in a vacuum. Even if we do get the best possible results, if our environment is overstimulating, chaotic, not supportive, you won't have a chance to make use of that. So context matters. And that's exactly what the system refuses to acknowledge. Just look at the accommodations that we're usually offered. More time on the test, not a different test structure. Noise-canceling headphones, but not a better space to focus. Strategies to cope, build habits, self-regulate, but never a less overwhelming life. You can buy a new ADHD app or some random-ass treatment that no one has regulated, but none of it actually works very long because we're treating the symptoms, never the cause. The cause being that the world that we live in, our school, work, environment, societal expectations, was not built for your brain. We have more mental health support than ever before, and yet our collective mental health is continuously getting worse. So if there are ways to fix things, why aren't they getting better? To answer that, Chapman says we have to zoom out. Our brains evolved over millions of years with hardly any environmental changes until pretty much 200 years ago. The amount of information they had to process was more or less the same. And then shit hit the fan. Today, we are swamped with information. There's lights, sounds, noise, ads, notifications everywhere. New technologies are popping up left and right, and we're expected to adapt to all of that or fall behind. After all, the economy has to grow forever, so now you do too. But how much can a monkey brain actually grow in such a short amount of time? There is just too much going on, too fast, and it's exhausting. Imagine you're born in 1800 with 30% ADHD traits, let's say. You work one job your whole life, you maybe move once or twice, maybe a new shop pops on your street, and that's it. That's all that happens. You're fine. But what if you're born in 2000? Those 30% might mean that you're scattered, overwhelmed, struggling to keep up with all of this stuff going on. You might be impaired enough to qualify for an official diagnosis, because your ADHD traits only become a disorder if they significantly impact your daily life, by definition. So same 30%, completely different life outcomes. As capitalism grows, this spectrum of normal functioning is shrinking ever more. Here's what Chapman had to say about autism and ADHD. Since the 2000s especially, the autism spectrum has continuously widened as an ever-rising percentage of the population falls short of the social, communicative, and sensory processing capabilities required by the new economy. As the norms of cognitive attention became increasingly restrictive, there also came a great rise in ADHD disablement. Since the 1980s, children and adults diagnosed with ADHD have ever increasingly required medication to enable functioning in line with educational and workplace demands alongside the cognitive stresses of day-to-day life. The expectations for what's normal keep rising, and if you can't keep up, you risk becoming a burden, abnormal. And I feel I have to mention what happens to those that the system labels burdens. because mental illness is not just some joke or a fun, booming market for profit. Historically, it was awful. Forced sterilizations, barbaric normalization practices, the near total extermination of people with schizophrenia in Germany during World War II. This isn't ancient history. It may be more sanitized now, but people still suffer. They're still ending up in poverty, prison, or just left behind. It's not an easy life. And now parents can test for genetic disorders and spare their unborn children the trouble of having a life with a mental illness or disorder, which, sure, if it's real bad, I get it. But there's research going into this thing, even for autism. Some sperm and egg banks are rejecting donors with ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. And if you're already born, you can now get unborn. Autistic people in Belgium and the Netherlands have already been able to do that. Not because they were terminally ill, but because they were isolated, unsupported, and frankly, tired of suffering. That was my whole thesis with this video, right? A happy, fulfilled life with ADHD or any other disorders and disabilities is increasingly becoming impossible under capitalism. Please don't give up if that's where you're at. Whatever you are suffering with, please find other people who have it too. ADHD friends are a lifeline for me. They get it, and I get them. We need each other, and we need you. Okay, so connect with someone, maybe in the comments, maybe posting in one of our Reddit communities, call a hotline, and talk to someone. Just please stay with us. That's where we're at in 2025. The world was made increasingly uninhabitable for neurodivergent people, and then individuals or private companies were left to determine whether neurodivergent life should even be reproduced in a world that fails to accommodate neurodivergence. How could any one person fix that all on their own? You would need superpowers. And that brings us to the most painful narrative of all. Haven't you heard? Narrative number 3, ADHD is a superpower. It's the narrative of hope in an otherwise pretty painful reality. And I want to believe it badly. I want to give people hope. But this is not the right way to do it. I mean, you don't hear this narrative said about the estimated 25 to 35% of prison populations that actually have ADHD, or those of us that are homeless, addicted to alcohol or drugs, or those that leave us. Why not? Did they voluntarily choose not to make use of their superpowers? You hear it about the successful ones. Michael Phelps, Adam Levine, all the entrepreneurs with ADHD everyone talks about. But even then, you don't hear the full story. Because as we said, the cost of success with ADHD is either your health, relationships, enjoyment of life, or having some kind of rare privilege. So who knows what these people have sacrificed? I do. It's all in this book. Oops. Phelps struggled a lot in school and actually used swimming as part of his treatment. Plus, he got around-the-clock support from his teacher mom who had already learned a lot about ADHD. Adam Levine struggled a lot too, both in school and with his music, but he got help from his parents and psychiatrists and credits those treatments for saving his music career. And yes, more people with ADHD are entrepreneurs as compared to the general population, but not for the reasons that most people think. As one study explains, people with ADHD chose entrepreneurship and/or left regular employment because they had problems with focus. They couldn't sustain interest in the mundane, repetitive tasks that companies typically require and wanted more flexibility and control over their employee life. But successful entrepreneurial ventures at some point also require persistence, perseverance, long-term planning, and organization. And this inability to focus would soon become their Achilles heel over time. People with the inattentive type of ADHD suffered the most personally and ended up with less take-home pay from their businesses. And when people had the impulsive, hyper version of ADHD, their overall business earnings suffered and they didn't stay in business for long. So yeah, entrepreneurship is pretty cool, but a lot of us do it out of necessity. We can't thrive in regular jobs, so we try to build a life that we can actually stand. And we struggle with that a lot, especially if we don't have the privileges or support. Like, I get meds, I've had therapy, my family helps me. I'm not some self-made superhero. And that's a privilege more of us have to acknowledge, especially those of us that are giving advice to others, like Peter Shankman, author of the book Faster Than Normal, the literal definition of the superpower narrative, and the first book I personally read after my diagnosis. In it, he explains how ADHD is actually this awesome gift that you can use to get ahead, and all that you have to do is just eat healthy, exercise, sleep well, simplify your life, get an assistant, have supportive family, and only work on the things that you're naturally good at. You know, easy stuff, accessible. As one Goodreads reviewer puts it, the book keeps repeating this idea that you can be amazing and successful and all that. And then the author goes on to say things like, if I didn't have a personal assistant, I would never survive. If I didn't buy tickets to China, I would never have found another space to get work done. Like, are you kidding? I don't have any of that. Who does? What about a book with a message about finding ways to succeed and developing your own useful strategies in a world that is not tailor-made for you? In a world where you will not have unlimited help and resources and control over your environment? What about instead of saying, if I didn't have X thing that 99% of my readers can't afford, I will be a failure and sad and overweight? You said it, Marita. The people who say ADHD is a superpower are at best romanticizing a very privileged experience of it, or ignoring just how much sacrifice it takes to function that way. And at worst, they are spreading misinformation and harmful stereotypes that shame those of us who can't access their superpowers. Either way, it puts all that responsibility back on us to fix ourselves. And that's not how we get real change or support. Worse, it might have some unwanted side effects. Chapman warns that if companies buy into the superpower narrative, they'll most likely want to cash in on it. A few of us might get hired as the creative ADHDer or the brilliant autistic, but only as long as they're useful. We'd have to act as our neurotype suggests, and that sounds really limiting and stressful and boring. So thanks, but no thanks. But also, what about everyone else? They'd still be left out, probably feeling even more ashamed than before. This will not lead to liberation in any meaningful sense for any but the most privileged neurodivergent people. This approach will inevitably exclude those with disabilities that require more immediate support who will remain discriminated against in the surplus, segregated, and controlled. So we have to be careful about our advocacy, and we have to be more honest with each other. I got a perfect score on my Bachelor of Science, but it took me twice as long to finish it. Without that option, I don't know what I would have done if I would have gotten one at all. I worked part-time at the start of my YouTube career. Otherwise, I wouldn't survive doing both things at once. And part-time jobs are rare, so that was lucky to find one and a privilege. I mean, of course I worked hard, but longer study times and flexible jobs aren't something that I earned. They are part of the system in Germany, and even there, they're quite rare. So if you can't finish your degree in just 3 years or launch your business while working full-time, I wouldn't blame you. I couldn't do that either. So Just be careful when you compare yourself to others because they might be making some sacrifices that you're not aware of, or they might have some privilege that you cannot access. And if you are one of those people on the other side, be honest. Don't spread some lies about superpowers. Demand real change for everyone. Because if you ever end up losing that privilege, you'd wish the system had changed too. So are we lazy, broken, fixable, or gifted? Oops. In reality, there are no simple answers. So let's drop all the labels and oversimplifications and talk about what ADHD actually is. The reality of ADHD. Your memory, your focus, your emotions, how you experience the world, everything is different when you have ADHD. And that's really hard for people to imagine. I mean, how can you imagine living life with a different brain when all you've ever known is your own? It's impossible, or just really, really rare. But that is exactly why it's so important that we validate each other's experiences and share our struggles with other ADHDers. As a community, we have to keep reminding each other that it's okay to do things differently, and that while ADHD is a disability, 100%, just how disabling it really is in practice depends so much on our environment. You can think of it like this. If you had to use a wheelchair and your city had ramps and elevators everywhere, you'd be able to get around just fine. But if your city only had stairs everywhere and no accessibility, you'd be stuck. Same disability, way more disablement. As the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation put it, it is society which disables physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on us on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. So disability isn't just a personal problem to fix. As Chapman explains, it has always existed in a context. You just have to look at the high rates of burnout, shame, and depression among ADHDers. To me, that alone shows that there's a serious mismatch between how we naturally function and how we're expected to function in our everyday environments like school, work, society as a whole. That's why burnout is way more common for ADHDers than it is for neurotypicals. But unlike neurotypical burnout, which is usually caused by chronic work stress or performance pressure, ADHD burnout is caused by the constant stress of having to live in a world that was not built for your brain. Even though those expectations that were put on you were never fair to begin with, it still feels like it's your fault. And that's why shame is so common for ADHDers. And then there's depression, the number one comorbid mental disorder for ADHDers. Because no matter how hard we keep trying, it will never feel like it's good enough or like we're good enough. And that is a soul-crushing thought. But please remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. None of this is your fault. You deserve to grieve the life you thought you could have, the one where things aren't so hard all the time, where your efforts actually pay off, where you feel understood, capable, and confident. Grief isn't a bad thing. It actually helps us to let go of the past and move forward to create a better future. So grieve for as long as you need. And when you're ready, let's talk about what that future could actually look like. A better future. Imagine that we live in a future where we stop worshiping profit and productivity over everything else and choose to put the value of life itself first. Your worth is no longer measured by your productivity. Rest is not something you have to earn, and your enjoyment of life is essential. No one has to mask their struggles to be accepted anymore because the future is inclusive by design. And that's a good thing. Diversity makes ecosystems stronger and more adaptable. That's why scientists have realized that it's best to protect diversity as a whole, to keep ecosystems balanced and functioning. And that includes human diversity. Different bodies, different brains, different ways of experiencing the world, functioning. That makes us more resilient. Basically, our better future needs diversity. And when it comes to having different brains, ADHD, autistic, etc., we're talking about neurodiversity. The neurodiversity movement challenges the idea that our brains are disordered and focuses instead on how our different ways of thinking and experiencing the world, when properly understood and supported, can benefit our species as a whole. Like, diverse groups that include both neurotypical and neurodivergent people have been proven to be more creative and come up with more original solutions than homogeneous groups. Our differences can complement each other and be beneficial. But that's not the point. Our worth to society shouldn't depend on proving that we're useful. It should be inherent. It is inherent. We're worthy because we exist, just like everyone else on this planet. That's what the neurodiversity movement is actually saying. It's not saying that it's easy or awesome to be neurodivergent. It's just saying we're not some kind of mistake to be fixed. That neurodiversity is a natural occurrence, like biodiversity, and that neurodivergent people deserve their own place in the ecosystem, one that doesn't force them to change who they are or sacrifice their quality of life just to survive. But as you might already realize, protecting neurodiversity and biodiversity, of course, is not exactly a priority in our capitalist system. Because what does a capitalist care about? Profit! And there is no immediate profit to be had in saving the forests or helping the animals. On the contrary, you can make so much money by exploiting them. And that's why we've wiped out an estimated 60% of all species in just the past 50 years. And there's no immediate value in protecting neurodivergent people either, not as long as they can sell us solutions or only include us when it's convenient. Because the truth is, we're expendable. There are enough neurotypical people, able people out there willing to do all the jobs. If we weren't, then they would have to find ways to accommodate us and include us. But there are. And that's really awesome for capitalism. But here's the scary bit. The expendable population isn't static. In fact, everyone becomes expendable at some point in their lives. Just look at how we're treating the elderly. They are useful, and then bam, they're burdens. They take too much money, too much care, too much pensions, blah, 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 blah. A single accident, illness, cognitive decline, psychological trauma, all the work stress from pushing yourself to be more grateful and productive over the years, aka burnout, can land you there too. Indeed, as Chapman says, neurotypicality is a temporary phase for any individual whose continuation becomes more unlikely with each passing year as capitalism intensifies. So it really is in everyone's best interest that we stop doing business as usual and start protecting the neurodivergent, the neurotypical, the able and disabled of any race, any age, any place, along with all the plant life, animal life, and the environment. Because as long as the system sees some of us as expendable, none of us are safe. They will find ways to exploit us until there are no other options and no more profits to be made. So we have to stick together and start being the change that we wish to see for the well-being of everyone. So how do we stop them from winning? What can you and I do about any of this today? solutions. According to Chapman and most other resources I read, there are 3 steps we can take in this process. Step number 1 is we have to educate ourselves first. Inequality, injustice, the empire of normality, capitalism, how the whole system works and who it actually serves, so that we can make sure that we don't reproduce all of its failures and mistakes in any of our future solutions. Once we've educated ourselves, we have to start educating others, raising awareness, getting people on board, students, workers, people who work in different fields like politics, justice, science, art. We need all kinds of people from all walks of life because they all have different unique ideas that we couldn't possibly come up with as individuals or even as a smaller group. Besides, each of these different unique groups will know their own interests and needs best, and we have to learn those and we have to keep those in mind if we want to create a better society that serves and empowers everyone. So raise awareness, work together on these solutions. And then we can move on to step 3, demand change. Because I don't think that any of the people who are currently benefiting from neurodivergent and other marginalization and oppression would be very happy to give up their privileges so easily. As Chapman says, neurodivergent disablement will always exist, but the mass disablement, constant anxiety, depression, and systemic discrimination shouldn't. And for that, we must reform the system and dismantle the very idea of normal. How do we do that exactly? I don't know. As we said, that is our long-term project that we have to figure out together, but there are some things we can do in the meantime. Of course, we just have to keep in mind that any solutions that we come up with within the capitalist system are still going to serve that system above all else. They could help you adapt, for example, but then the system would not have to change. They could help you fit in, but then you'd have to sacrifice who you are. And they could help you fix yourself, but then you'd have to believe that you're broken. So please remember, the system is broken, not you. Don't believe that you are lazy or less than. Don't take the blame for its failures. Remember our long-term goal. Any solutions that we talk about at this stage are just survival hacks. Because, as Chapman says, neurodiversity activism is limited to the individual, institutional, and legal levels, rather than challenging the deeper structures of the economic order that sustains our disablement in the first place. That being said, now we'll go through some transitional solutions that are proposed by the neurodiversity movement and later by myself as an ADHD coach. Starting with recognition. We must demand recognition for ADHD and other disabilities from our governments so that we can receive support such as healthcare, accommodation, and benefits. In the meantime, we can contribute to alternative, community-based forms of support. For example, peer support groups, where people are coming together to share experiences, struggles, to give each other advice. Mutual aid networks, where people come together to help each other with their needs like food, water, transport, medication, basic care, or even money. Resource or skill sharing spaces where people can exchange their knowledge and resources without using money. So someone might help you with your taxes and you help them edit their resume. Safe spaces for expression and connection with others where everyone can unmask and socialize without that fear of being judged, or even co-working, co-living, co-ops. These constructs where people can pull together their resources, support each other, and share the responsibilities, like splitting their rent or their groceries, co-managing the workspace or housing, and just making sure that no one person has to do everything by themselves. People are doing incredible things out there, and I'm genuinely so amazed by and grateful for everyone who is making something happen in whatever way they can. getting involved in one of these things can seriously change your life. So I really recommend seeing what's available in your area. And if there's nothing, maybe you could be the one to start something yourself. Then we reclaim the definition of health as harmony instead of just acting or thinking like everyone else. That's not health. That is a standard set by the capitalist system. One obvious example of that is the treatment of left-handed people. Being left-handed was never celebrated. It was belittled and mocked, but it wasn't that bad. It didn't have a huge impact on people's lives until the Industrial Revolution, when machines were mass-produced, and of course they fit the average right-handed worker. So suddenly the left-handed workers appeared slower, clumsier, less efficient than them, and of course they were judged for it. At school, left-handed children were sometimes even beaten for using the wrong hand and taught to have to write with it, even though it was really uncomfortable and unpleasant for them. At that point in time, being left-handed suddenly became this hugely disruptive thing in people's lives, and it was bad, sometimes even pathologized. But left-handed people were never the problem. It was the system that changed and adapted to serve the average right-handed person that left them behind. And when the system eventually changed yet again, because we developed better machines and pens you could write with either hand, desk jobs you could do regardless because it's just typing, most people don't think that left-handedness is disordered or bad anymore. But now, with all of these desk jobs, knowledge work, we are. Because autism, ADHD, and neurodivergence means that we are thinking and functioning differently. Yet, most schools and workplaces are still designed for the right-handed, neurotypical majority. Now, it's bad to be neurodivergent, sometimes even pathologized. But just like the left-handed people back then, we are not the problem. We are not in harmony with our environments or our communities, and that makes it nearly impossible for us to find harmony within ourselves. That is what is actually making us sick and unnecessarily increasing our suffering and disablement. We need schools, workplaces, cities, and communities that support our different ways of thinking and being. So we have to force the system to adapt. Now, what does that look like in practice? Most importantly, like educating people about neurodivergence, reminding them that disability is not an individual problem, and maybe even explaining the concept of the excess or surplus population and how pretty much everyone joins it at some point. Then we move to campaigning for change, while being careful, of course, not to exclude any of us or make things worse for any of us. And finally, neuroqueering, the equivalent of neurodivergent pride. So embracing our weirdness as a type of resistance, disrupting the norms of everyday life with our behavior, identity, creativity, unapologetically being ourselves. This is such an amazing and effective form of activism, I think. But we also have to remember that being visible is a privilege. So if you can't afford to speak up or take part in neuroqueering because of school, work, or other risks, please don't worry. You really don't have to put yourself in a tough spot to help out. But if you can get involved more actively, joining a neurodivergent trade union or worker collective is one of the most powerful things you can do. These are groups that are advocating for better working conditions for neurodivergence, flexible hours, sensory-friendly environments, other accommodations like that. They push back against hostile policies and educate employers about our differences. Another solution you can join today is a neurodivergent-friendly cooperative. So a business or organization that is owned by its members collectively, not by the boss or some outside investors. Everyone shares the ownership. So everyone's needs are valued and important, and they get a say in how things are done. The work structure, the pace, time off, environment, everything. Cooperatives are like these little havens within the capitalist system where people really do come for profit today. These are the neurodiversity movement's main solutions at the moment, as Chapman describes them. But for now, finally, I'd like to share some of my own solutions as an ADHD coach, things that you can do today to survive late-stage capitalism while also working towards that better future. For me, it all starts with understanding your brain, what ADHD actually is, how it works, how it shapes your behaviors, what are the symptoms that you could be having, and more importantly, what are their root causes. Because, for example, you can procrastinate for a billion reasons. That is just a symptom. The root cause could be low energy, task switching struggles, an emotional blockage, not having enough information. So you solving procrastination isn't the goal. You have to look for that root cause underneath and work on that instead. Of course, if you have access or means to get help in that, I highly recommend it as well. Psychiatric appointments, therapy sessions, ADHD coaching, please reach out and get it if possible. Walk that road with someone who can guide you, protect you from all the bullshit, hold space, and just be a positive present in your life. So that's my number one. Number two, you have to let yourself grieve that neurotypical life that was promised to you. That is simply not possible when you have ADHD, again, without a certain amount of sacrifice or privilege. Because beyond that grief is acceptance. And acceptance is the most powerful, the most important part of living a happier life with ADHD. When you finally have that acceptance, you can start seeing your shortcomings for what they really are. Genuine struggles that are perfectly normal in our current society. Then you can gradually learn to stop shaming yourself, feeling guilty, comparing yourself unfairly to neurotypicals, feeling behind in life, and you can start giving your brain the support that it needs, learning to do things your way, rebuilding your confidence, feeling at peace with yourself. It is such a beautiful thing. And ironically, we are often able to do more and be more productive once we start doing things our way anyway. Even though that's not the goal and it never should be, it is more productive for what it's worth. Number three is the most powerful way to strengthen that self-acceptance. And that is to connect with others. Friends, support systems, people who get it. Being around those things can help you see yourself in a new light. After all, we are our harshest critics. But when we see someone going through the same things that we go through, we find a new form of empathy for that we can hopefully also extend to ourselves later. If you can, please join any active community of ADHDers. We talked about quite a few options so far. So if anything inspired you, if anything touched your heart while I was talking about it, that might be the right thing to start with for you. Then you can start adjusting your life to work for your brain. For example, by completely avoiding the things that you struggle with, finding ways to delegate specific tasks to other people, doing something else instead so that they can take over those things you struggle with, or just actively choosing to let those things go if that is possible, if that is a thing. And if you can't do that, you have to find ways to make those things that you struggle with easier for you by default, automatically. So let's say that you struggle with cooking. If you have enough money, you could hire someone to cook for you. If you have a partner that loves to cook and is okay with doing that, you could ask them to take over. That is the avoiding scenario. If instead you go out and buy a bunch of healthy frozen meals that you can just throw in the microwave for 2 minutes and it's done, that is you making the task of cooking easier by default. That's the kind of solutions you want to find first. And finally, number 5 is to always take action with care and kindness for yourself. So when you have to do those things that you struggle with, don't force yourself to push through. Don't push past your limits and get burnt out. That's not sustainable, and it doesn't even work most of the time. So I know capitalism does not make it easy to slow down and take care of yourself, but please do it anyway. Whenever it's safely possible, take care of yourself. We need you to be healthy and happy, and isn't that what life is all about? Why are we here if we're going to suffer? Besides, we have to remember our long-term goal. Real systemic change with built-in inclusivity, health, and enjoyment for everyone. It's a much better future for all of us and the planet, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. And we can't do that work if we keep sacrificing our health and our energy for the sake of productive output and lining the pockets of the ruling class. So I want to leave you with a quote from the new prequel of the Hunger Games books, Sunrise on the Reaping. It's really interesting, I promise. It has a lot to do with this. But if you don't know, the Hunger Games is a story about this dystopian society that is split in a capital city, the capital, where people are living these lavish lives, controlling everything, hoarding all the resources, and then 12 districts of people that basically live in oppression and poverty just to serve the capital. They've had this big war at some point where the capital wins, and as punishment, they decide to send 2 kids from each district to fight to the death every year. Last one alive wins. That's basically what the Hunger Games are. They go on for 75 years until we meet the main character of the original books, Katniss, that ends up leading a rebellion that ends the oppressive regime and the Hunger Games, to put it very shortly. Sunrise on the Reaping, the prequel, takes place 25 years before that successful rebellion. And in it, we learn that it wasn't the first one. People have been trying to rebel the whole time, pretty much. And the main character of this prequel gets swept up in one of those earlier rebellions. They put this epic plan together and everyone's helping, but of course, they fail. So by the end, he's dejected, desperate, basically wondering if anything he did, any of their efforts mattered at all. He shares that with one of his comrades, and their response was life-changing for me. The comrade tells him that even though everything tanked, people died, and it was really awful, one of their guys has already started working on the next thing. And he even asked him if he wants to join. To which our guy replies, "Oh, I see. He's going to overthrow the capital, is he?" "Maybe one day," the comrade says, "but we can't any of us do it alone. We need your help." "Me?" the guy replies. "I'm living proof that the capital always wins. I tried to change things and now everything's failed. You don't want me." "But we do want you. You were capable of imagining a different future. Maybe it won't be realized today, maybe not in our lifetime. Maybe it will take generations. We're all part of that continuum. Does that make it pointless?" "I just don't know," the guy replies. "But I do know that you need someone different from me." "No," the comrade says. "We need someone exactly like you." "Just luckier?" he asks. "Luckier or with better timing. Having an army at their back wouldn't hurt. And if we can't find one, we'll have to build one." This conversation, with the context that 25 years later, Katniss will try a very similar thing to their plot but actually finally succeed, is so powerful. The main books are written from her point of view, her perspective, so you never get all of that backstory. They seem almost as if she came along and people suddenly came together, mobilized, and did this awesome revolution. But here you learn that it's actually been a long time coming, a lot of work, a lot of sacrifice. And it makes sense when you think about it, of course. But like those first Hunger Games books, focusing on Katniss's perspective, we are also mostly focused on our perspective, our timeline, our story, our life, not the whole picture, not the whole timeline. And in that, we often forget that change can take generations, that not everybody gets to lay that final brick. But if nobody has laid the foundation before that, no one can. So their contributions, even if they seemed unsuccessful or pointless at the time, were actually vital. Maybe they never even lived to see the fruits of their labor, but they did plant the seeds, and that was important. So it won't happen today or tomorrow, but change will happen. Don't give up. Don't feel hopeless, because what we do today matters more than you know. And don't ever let the machine eat you. Promise me.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Thank you so much for watching. This was a lot of work, my heart and soul. I hope it changed something for you. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please don't forget to share it with others. Leave a like, leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to see more. And if you're feeling generous, you can support me on Ko-fi, link in the description, or use the thanks button below to help out. Your support in whatever form, whether it's just watching the videos or commenting on donating, is what keeps me going. So I thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. If you'd like to learn more about the reality of ADHD, I have a really deeply researched video with all the statistics of life outcomes, differences to neurotypical lives that you can share with people or you can watch for yourself if you need some validation. Click here to watch why untreated ADHD is worse than you think.